Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, the Bigfoot Chronicles, shall we say. I'm so glad you've joined me today and I'm so delighted that you're here to listen to another story. So before we get started, you know the rules. Go and get yourself something absolutely fabulous to drink, whether it's something warm and comforting or something effervescent and sparkling, because I've got a lovely story for you this evening. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I grew up in Galway in Ireland, the land that has earned its illustrious reputation as the Emerald Isle, surrounded by wild, rugged, rocky scenery and lush green fields that go on forever. My family lived in one of those traditional stone-gabled walled white cottages with a thatched roof and a very bright red front door, which always looked particularly arresting and eye-catching against the visually awe-inspiring viridescent greens of the countryside. It would seem the tumbling pink wild roses, mingled with the wispy curls of purple wisteria, weaved their glorious delicate foliage over the front facade of our home, giving the cottage a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale feel about it, which I never truly appreciated until later on in my life, when I realised just how idyllic my life on the Emerald Isle had actually been. Everything about growing up in this part of the world was both enchanting and magical. There were people who talk about the legends of the Fae, many who claimed to have had sightings of humanoid fairies, stories I took with a large pinch of salt, but many believed were absolutely true. I was not immune to the idiosyncratic or bizarre occurring in my early life. I experienced a plethora of very strange situations that opened me up to the distinct realization that our world is not as it may seem. For many, our world might be as straightforward as a chocolate cake with vanilla frosting, and that's about it. But I was soon to learn that there were many more dense, interesting layers to that cake that have so often been overlooked, even discounted, like the hazelnut and the chocolate or cinnamon swirl, that if you're not paying attention, you will surely miss out on, for you might never ever get the opportunity to taste the subtle flavours for yourself if your senses aren't finely tuned into them. I think I learned growing up that if you don't pay attention to your environment, you surely will miss out. If you don't investigate something strange that you might hear of, see or even encounter, then you will almost certainly brush it off as something insignificant and irrelevant. If on the other hand you do happen to own an inquisitive spirit, like I do, then you might find yourself opening a door that leads to a treasure trove of mystery, or an Aladdin's cave that could literally blow your mind. It may indeed make you say, "My God, did that really happen? Or was that an illusory dream?" Sometimes you might doubt what you experienced or witnessed, but even if you do, your mind will be forever expanded, becoming more malleable and more open to the peppering of mystery that showers our world, with its clandestine, mysterious secrets that will always be revealed to the seeker. Hence the age-old saying, "He who seeks will find," and if you search for answers long enough, you will almost certainly find your truth. Of that there is no doubt in my mind. I was raised by my grandmother, as my mother gave birth to me when I was only 15 years old, with the help of my grandmother at her side, assisting in my delivery, on a hard, unwelcome, very cold black and white bathroom floor, on a miserably cold winter's night, when the temperatures were at an all-time low. It was quite literally freezing, with gale-force winds beating against the cottage. I certainly picked the most inopportune moment to be born. But then throughout my life, timing has never been one of my stronger points. My mother's pregnancy had remained cloak and dagger for the full 9 months' duration. It was surreptitiously brushed under the carpet, away from prying, curious eyes, for no one was to know about the secret my mother was carrying in her womb. That would bring dreadful shame on our family and potentially devastate our family name. In those days, people cared a great deal about honour, reputation and integrity. And a young 15-year-old girl falling pregnant out of wedlock, well, that was not a good look. Even worse was anyone daring to abort the fetus of an unborn child. That was considered murder in the first degree, in the opinions of many of the religious folk. Indeed, that was a greater shame than falling pregnant itself. Abortion was a filthy word that people were even afraid to articulate, as if it was a deadly virus that might just contaminate their own lives. My grandmother was about 48 when she had to claim she was pregnant with me, so that when I arrived on the scene, no one would bat an eyelid. I gather she'd stuff her belly up with a couple of old towels she had sewn together on a sewing machine to make a very convincing pregnancy belly. She managed to pull off the fake pregnancy with flying colours, although people were stunned that she was having a child so late in the day. But they saw it as a gracious gift of God, a miracle of note. "Oh, such wonderful news, Peggy! I'm thrilled for you," my grandmother was told over and over again. "A late lamb, that's what it's called. A true gift from God. You've struggled all your life, haven't you, to have children? But now your womb has been blessed a second time, even so late in the day. The good Lord hears our prayers, just like Sarah in the Bible, when she was pregnant at such an old age, but she managed to conceive. The Lord is so good, so very good." My grandmother told me that she felt like she was playing a part in a movie of the expectant mum-to-be. "I almost began to believe I was actually pregnant with you," she told me. "People would come up to me and talk to me about my expected baby and ask me whether I thought you were going to be a girl or a boy, what I'd actually call you when you did arrive on the scene. Many thought if I was born a girl, I should be called Grace, as that was a gift of God. When my birth mother Shannon was heavily pregnant with me, and was showing so obviously in her last trimester, she was no longer seen around town for those 3 months. So my grandmother would claim that my mother had been suffering from dreadful fainting fits and a mysterious illness that had become her, that the doctors were unable to diagnose, so that no one would be able to discern the true deception occurring under their nose in plain sight. When Shannon's pretty face did re-emerge in our town again, the mysterious illness had miraculously been diagnosed, and she declared she'd been dramatically healed. Believe me, it's not easy to keep secrets in a small town. A whiff of something smelling slightly off on the wind can get the entire community whispering behind closed doors, over stone walls, in local stores, pubs and church corridors. And believe me, when the gossip starts, it can be like a Californian wildfire, almost impossible to put out. My grandfather Frank was a man who'd never lied a single day in his life, so pulling off this fictitious charade in front of the townsfolk had been a momentous struggle for him. But I think our family's reputation overruled his desire to be honest. He persuaded himself that being deceptive on behalf of the family honour was a price well worth paying, but it wasn't easy for him by any manner of means. In the early years of my life, I always grew up believing I was my grandmother's daughter, with an older sister, Shannon, 15 years my senior, who was actively involved in my life, and like a second mother to me, until I was 10 years old, when she went to America to visit relatives and never came back home. At the time, I was completely devastated when I learnt she'd met a very nice American suitor called Seamus and was now living in Montana on his ranch, and they were soon to get married. I knew I was unlikely to see my sister for a long time, if history was anything to go by. Let's just say when Irish immigrants left the Emerald Isle in 1845 for the Americas, due to the dreadful potato famine that had decimated their food supply, they never came back, like so much of my family line, who were now living in America. Some who'd been born in America, and subsequently had never visited the Emerald Isle for themselves, but were nevertheless very proud of their Irish ancestry, of which there were notable celebrations on St. Patrick's Day throughout the United States, where people of Irish ancestry congregated together in bars and down the streets, wearing green regalia. Love is a very strange thing, my grandmother had explained to me, trying to justify to me why my mother had abandoned her life in Ireland, like an old pair of green socks she wanted to exchange for some bright red, blue and white ones with pretty patterns of stars and stripes. You know, it creeps on you unaware. There's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Your plans have to change exponentially. Your life has to change. My grandmother had made falling in love sound like a very unfortunate, inopportune disease you contracted that put a spanner in the works, upset the apple cart, turned your whole life upside down. It certainly had succeeded in doing that to mine. I missed my sister Shannon dreadfully, and a bright spark had gone out of my life. I quickly began to reminisce over the wistful sound of my sister's tumbling laughter coming from the kitchen, or watching her hovering dutifully over the oven with her gloves on her hands, bringing out a freshly baked loaf of piping hot bread that would fill our kitchen with the most amazing smells. She'd look up at me and say, "Dotty, are you hungry? How about some nice warm bread with butter and strawberry jam for you?" I would say, "Yummy!" And there I would be, sitting around the kitchen table, hungrily tucking into warm bread, with Shannon watching me with a bright warm smile on her face. In truth, there was nothing quite like it, but now she was gone from my life. I wanted to be happy for Shannon. I really did. I loved my sister, and her going away like this meant I felt the emptiness of her loss quite dreadfully. It grieved my heart something bad, as it did both of my parents. "Why is it, when the Irish go to America, they never come back?" my grandmother would protest. "Why can't Shannon settle down here? Bring her American fellow with her, not the other way round." "Well, it's not that simple, sweetheart. You must understand, the man she's marrying is a very successful rancher. He can't just leave his life in America behind. Whereas Shannon, well, she could settle down anywhere, couldn't she? It makes sense that she would stay there with him." Soon my sister was to announce she was married to Seamus, in a short private ceremony, devoid of any fuss, from which me and my parents had intentionally not been invited, out of practicality and common sense. Shannon would have loved nothing better than for us to be in attendance on her big day, but she didn't want my parents spending a vast fortune to make that quintessential trip over to America just for her wedding. In those days, travel like this was a huge deal, usually left for the more affluent and wealthy. It was an extravagant expense they could ill afford. My mother read us her letter around a crackling fire that was burning away merrily in the hearth, while we listened to her fabulous descriptions of her special day. We had to close our eyes tightly, pretending we'd been there all along. But her delightful letter did make us laugh, and me miss her all the more. I felt a very close attachment to my sister, for reasons I could never explain, that one day would become all too obvious to me. What can I say, Mum, Dad, Dotty? I missed you so much. It was such an awful shame you weren't here to enjoy the wedding with me. But I did mention you in our small celebrations, and everybody drank to you, toasting you, while you were possibly fast asleep in your beds. Given the time difference, of course. I wore a very simple white dress for the day, that I didn't even buy from a bridal shop. It was a kind of dress I can wear again. You know me. Practicality is my middle name. We had a fabulous wedding cake, prepared for us by an illustrious baker in town. We went for an ordinary vanilla sponge. The cake unfortunately got knocked over by one of Seamus's golden Labradors called Dogman. I think he knocked the cake over on purpose when his tail went thrashing against the table and dismantled the whole thing. It went crashing violently onto the ground, landing on the floor in an unretrievable mess, so we never even got to cut the cake. Both Doffman and the other yellow lab, Viola, gobbled up the entire cake between the two of them, and spent the whole of the next day lying on their backs with extended stomachs and tongues hanging out, trying to digest the thousands of calories that they had ingested in a single sitting. Everyone thought it was hilarious, and Seamus said at least his dogs had thoroughly enjoyed the wedding, almost as much as we did. Our only regret is you weren't there. I know it's not easy not to have been involved in her wedding, but it's for the best, said my mother. It was so thoughtful of Shannon not to invite us, and I mean that literally. She knows we'd have insisted on coming, and the cost of those air tickets, oh goodness gracious, they're through the roof. I know Shannon would like us to come to America, but on our own terms, when we can make a big holiday of it, a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. She's always been such a thoughtful, considerate girl like this, and she certainly seems to have found herself a wonderful husband. We must all be very happy for her. One day when I returned home to Rose Wisteria Cottage, an hour earlier than was expected after visiting my best friend in town, I could hear both my parents arguing loudly in the kitchen, and the heated altercation seemed to permeate the heavy walls of our cottage. They'd obviously not heard the sound of my clattering bicycle rolling down our cobblestone pathway, or the rattling sound of it being haphazardly flung against the old stone shed. I was not exactly quiet on my approach. My clamorous, indelicate boots were noisy as I marched to the front door, flinging it open, slamming it behind me with a loud bang. I trotted down the passageway, stopping short outside the kitchen door. I think both my parents were far too distracted to notice that I'd actually returned home. I remember my ears were flapping like an elephant. They never argued, so their uncharacteristic raised voices of discord grabbed my attention almost at once. I wanted to know what on earth was going on, so I surreptitiously eavesdropped outside the door. What had irked them so much to get them so hot under the collar, I wondered. By nature, my even-tempered, insouciant parents were very chilled, easy-going, mellow folk, who rode the storms of life harmoniously, with an impressive ease, not allowing any hiccups or bumps on the journey to get them down. But on this consequential, indelible afternoon, I could feel an incongruous tension brewing in the air. I was always by nature a curious child, so I stood outside the kitchen door soaking in their words like a dry sea sponge, trying to make sense of what they were actually saying, but making no sense of anything at all. "You have to tell Dotty," I could hear my father's booming voice. "This secret has gone on long enough. Does she not deserve to know the truth? Besides, you don't have a choice in the matter, now that Shannon is involved." "But you can't possibly tell Dotty the truth. It would break her heart, don't you see? It would make her believe her whole life was a lie," came my mother's pained voice. "That's just it, Peggy. Her whole life has been a lie up to now. She needs to know the truth, does she not? She needs to know who she is. Besides, now that Shannon wants Dotty in her life, there is not a brass farthing we can do about it. You do realize that she holds all the trump cards, unless, of course, we choose to be unreasonable. I certainly don't want to turn Shannon against us, but that's what we'll do if we kick up a fuss over this. We have to do what she says in this matter. The choice is not ours to make. We don't have that kind of luxury on our side." "But don't you see, Frank? Sometimes it's best to leave things be. It's so much better that way. When you throw a stone in the water, what happens? It has a ripple effect, doesn't it? What will be the repercussions of telling a child something like this? I think we must phone Shannon at once. Tell her the idea is extremely ludicrous. We can't do this to little Dotty so late in the day. She's 10 years old, for goodness sake. She's so settled. She's happy. This will only confuse her. And going to America? No, I'm sorry. That's crazy. When will we ever get to see her again? America is a long way away, is it not?" "I'm sorry, Peggy, but this is not about you. Nor is it about me. Nor is it about us. It's about Shannon and what she wants for little Dotty. We have to respect her wishes. It's the ethical thing for us to do in the circumstances, don't you see?" I immediately barged into the kitchen. I was a spirited young girl, and if my parents were keeping a secret from me, I wanted to know all about it. "What are you keeping from me?" I demanded, resting my little arms on my hips obstinately, as my steely blue eyes swept assertively from my father to my mother. "Well, what are you not telling me? I want to know." I was stamping my feet pugnaciously. My parents had better tell me what they were hiding from me, or I'd badger them until they told me the truth. I was one of those petulant kids that knew how to get my mother to give in, like when she took me to the store. I had learnt a little confrontational pestering here, some impassioned nudging there, would go a significantly long way to getting exactly what I wanted. My mother would ultimately surrender, coming down like a calming bridge over tumultuously troubled waters. To keep the peace, she would ultimately acquiesce. She'd buy me that candy bar I'd been nagging her for. I think it was so much easier for her to just give in to me than to have to constantly tell me no. No was not a word that I embraced very easily in my vocabulary. The uncongenial word meant boundaries, restrictions, deprivation. I think my mother found no an exhausting word when dealing with a daughter as tenaciously headstrong and presumptuous as I was. I could see relief wash over my father's face, as if my eavesdropping had somehow brought an end to a troubling secret that they had hidden away from me for so many years, that was now being forced to come out, like the last toothpaste in the tube that grudgingly decides to show itself after a great deal of coaxing, prodding and squeezing. My mother's face had paled. The colour had vacated her skin so that she became a ghostly shade of white. I could see a lugubrious glaze in her regretful eyes, and her dejected, sorrowful head dropped to the ground, almost as if she was ashamed. She was definitely avoiding my gaze. I'd never seen her look so pained before. I could observe tears stuck in the corners of her eyes that she was struggling to contain. She didn't want me to see that she was so close to crying, but I did not miss a trick. The secret, whatever it was, had to be dreadfully big for my mother to be so ruffled up, so upset. She was normally indomitably stoic, like the solid oak tree in our yard. "If you're not going to tell her, Peggy, I will," my father had piped. "Besides, we have no choice in the matter. Shannon wants us to tell her the truth. We have to tell her now, regardless. We should have done this a long time ago, I hasten to say." Shannon was in on this secret too, I thought, the horror now becoming all too apparent. 3 members of my family had been harbouring a secret that they'd kept from me. What were they not telling me? My mother growled at my father. She gave him dagger looks with her brown eyes and said, "I'll tell her myself, Frank. This needs to be done my way. Do you understand?" My mother washed her hands at the kitchen sink, dried them on a hand towel, and gestured for me to take a seat, which I did. Before long, my mother and Dad were sitting directly opposite me, on the long, rather wobbly kitchen table. I remember an anxiety washed over me at once. The mood was so sombre, so serious. The kitchen had grown so quiet that you could only hear the sound of the kitchen clock ticking away on its prime position on the wall, until our very big cat, Eartha, launched herself through the kitchen window, pounded onto the kitchen countertop like a rocket being launched from outer space. She was a very overweight tabby of ample girth, so her rather heavy crash landings onto surfaces of any kind were at best ungainly and at worst precarious. Sometimes even the kitchen would shudder and heave when she crashed into things like a mild earthquake. Let's just say Eartha did not know the meaning of the word grace. Eartha wobbled over to her bowl of kibble and began to crunch away happily, oblivious to the sound of silence that was so conspicuous that even I could hear it. It was between the crunching sounds of the cat's kibble being macerated by hungry jaws and the sounds of the tick-tocking kitchen clock that another rocket was launched, but this time it came fortuitously directly out of my mother's mouth, causing devastation on its outward trajectory, hitting me straight in the guts with the efficiency of sharp shrapnel, tearing me apart limb from limb. This I had not expected. Most secrets I thought were good, exciting, dappled with mystery and intrigue. But this was a secret that seared through bone, marrow and sinew with a prompt efficiency that tore my perception of my life up into smithereens, as if someone had walked over to our large kitchen dresser, which was elegantly displayed with some very old collectible blue and white china, and flung it onto the ground so violently. And all that was left was a chaotic disarray and a plethora of broken china, and even a dresser that had fallen apart. In this case, I was that broken china, lying there on the floor. "You're not my daughter, Dotty. I didn't give birth to you," my grandmother said, her eyes circumventing mine. I think she didn't want to witness the shocked pain in my eyes. She was so sure she would see. When she said this, I felt as if an ice-cold dagger had been stabbed directly through my heart, as a numb, vacuous feeling seemed to snake through my guts. My knees wobbled, my feet began to tap very fast on the flagstone kitchen floor. My mouth dropped wide open. "What do you mean I'm not yours? Am I adopted? Is that what you're saying?" The full horror hitting me like a cruel, cold slap to the face. "You are ours," said my mother, grabbing my hand, giving it a tight, reassuring squeeze. "Of course you're ours. You must understand. Nothing has changed. We love you with all our hearts. You're the shining light of our lives. Nothing has changed in that regard. You must know that, Dotty." "Get on with it, Peggy," my grandfather moaned. "You're not explaining yourself very well. You need to tell Dotty everything." My mother cocked her brows. "I'm doing my best, Frank," she said obsequiously. "If you'd stop butting in, I might be able to explain everything to Dotty. But your interfering is making it very hard for me to put thoughts into words. I'm struggling here. I don't need your constant jabs, making it 1,000 times worse for me." My eyes began to fill with tears. A girl in my class had told me a story of a baby once being found in a dumpster. Is that what had happened to me? My lips grew white. I was frightened about what I was going to be told. Maybe some secrets are best not unearthed after all. Ignorance can be bliss, and for the very first time in my life, I wasn't exactly sure I wanted to be privy to this secret. If it had made my mother so dreadfully upset, and my father so subdued and sombre, what on earth would it do to me? "Did you find me in a dustbin? Are you saying my birth mother didn't want me? She threw me out in the trash and you found me, lying among the old potato peels and rotten banana skins? Is that what you're going to tell me? Because if that's what happened, I don't want to know," I said, my eyes misting over with tears, my hands blocking both of my ears. My mother pulled one of my hands off my ear. "Listen to me. It was nothing like that. You're such a silly one. As if anyone would ever throw you in the trash. What a nonsensical, ludicrous idea, Dotty. Listen to yourself. No, you are wanted, very wanted, and very much loved, and still are. What I'm trying to say, Dotty, is that I'm not your mother. I'm your grandmother. And your sister Shannon, well, she's your real mother. So we're still your real family. It's just, how shall I put it, the dynamics have changed ever so slightly. But that's all. Now that you know the truth, everything is still exactly the same. Nothing is different." "But why?" I gasped, unable to understand the huge contorted jumble of my life that seemed to be knotted and twisted up in the most incredulous, messy tangle, which made no sense to me at all, until everything had been fully explained. And in truth, I wasn't sure if I was better off knowing this inconvenient truth. It made everything so much more confusing. My sister Shannon was my mother, and my mother was my grandmother. That was a strange concept to get my head around. It was going to take a while to get used to. "So why are you telling me all this?" I asked. "There's no easy way to say this to you, Dotty, sweetheart. But your sister Shannon, or should I say your mother, wants you to move to America. You are her daughter, after all. Of course, legally she wouldn't have a leg to stand on, as the authorities believe that you are my daughter, who I claim to have given birth to in my own bathroom at home. And so on paper, you are legally my daughter, although, of course, with advances in modern science, I'm sure it could be one day proved that Shannon was your mother. But we won't go there. Now, of course, your birth was a traumatic event, let's not kid. We didn't have anyone to help us. No midwives, no hospital, nothing like that. Your mother was in so much pain. and you were taking your time coming out. But finally we managed to successfully deliver you on the coldest, most windy night of the year. Needless to say, your grandfather and I know that you are really Shannon's daughter. We never told you the truth because Shannon was 15 years old when she gave birth to you. Let's just say a 15-year-old girl falling pregnant would have created some cruel scandals in town. It would make your mother look like a woman of low moral standing. And we couldn't have our daughter's reputation soured and torn to shreds like that, or the family name being dragged through the gutter. People would likely have pointed fingers at Frank and me, saying we'd raised our daughter to be a harlot. You know how people's tongues can be so cruel, so unkind, so vindictive. Shannon didn't deserve that, nor did we. Let's just say her unfortunate frolic with a young man in a haystack would never have happened if she hadn't been so bladdered on that fateful night, when she was not fully aware of what she was actually doing. You see, Dotty, drink can blow away your inhibitions, make you do things that in the cold light of day you would never be persuaded to do. But who is my real dad? My grandmother looked sorrowful. Even your mother doesn't know the answer to that question, sweetheart. She went to a barn dance, you see, when she was young, and the punch was spiked with alcohol. She vaguely remembers tumbling around in that haystack with that young man, kissing him, but she can't remember who he was. No memory of him at all. That's what she claims, said my grandfather, raising one of his white albino-looking caterpillar brows. I think she knows who the man was, but she's never had the bottle to tell us. But maybe you can find out from her when you see her yourself, if she's willing to tell you. How do you feel about going to live in America, my little peanut? A lot of our relatives live there, you know. You'll meet so much of our extended family. They'll be thrilled to see you. I don't want to go, I protested. I can't go. I won't go. I want to stay here. I began to stamp my foot indignantly. But convincing my grandparents to change their mind was not as easy as persuading my grandmother to buy me candy. But don't you miss Shannon? My grandmother had asked, holding my hand tightly. Isn't it important for you to go to be with your mother? Of course I miss her, but I like living here with you. I've got friends here. I'm happy here. Why would I want to move to America? Because sometimes, sweetheart, it's the right thing to do. So that's the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and it's terribly exciting, so don't miss out. Until next time, goodbye and good night.